to be able to clearly understand forums like this in plain. And so far, I have, this is my first time really getting into the meat of this. And so Troy, and I would say his son has made this, his 4-year-old has made this breakdown extremely well. And I say that because I asked Troy and his, if he could break this down in the way that his son could understand it, because that's the way I understand. And he has been a great dad and a great explainer for me in that way that I needed. So, yeah, so that's it for me. So Caitlin, now to you.
Thanks, Mahogany. I'm Caitlin Kershid, also a District 1 parent and member of the Parent Student Advisory Committee. So I'm just going to go over our agenda. We're going to have a little welcome from Director Davis. We'll present our goals of the meeting. Then we're going to have our OUSD staff presentation by Mr. Troy Christmas and DeCarlos. I'm forgetting your name now, but you'll introduce yourself then. And then we're going to move into breakout rooms, just for a chance to people to ask questions in a smaller space. So feel free to use the chat as we're presenting, but we're not going to really do any Q&A or answering of questions outside of the chat until we come back from the breakout rooms. And then we'll have time to kind of go over what was raised in the breakout rooms and ask more questions. So we appreciate Director Davis and all the staff that are here tonight, as well as all the community members.
Sam, you're muted.
I'm really having some Zoom beginner issues tonight. I just want to appreciate Caitlin and Mahogany for introducing and for just framing, the goals of what we're doing tonight. And they're going to talk a little bit more in a minute. But I know for me, I haven't done one of these forums in a while, as you may have noticed from my Zoom foibles. But, it's really important to me to ground what I'm doing in just the successes that I've had. It's been a tough time on the board for lots of reasons, but passing Measure H last fall, and you see here, this is from the celebration at Fremont High School of College and Career for All. It's just the joy that I felt in bringing more resources into the district in a way that are very transparent, they're very accountable, and they've had real success for our students. And so I do believe that it is possible for us to have that transparency, for us to have that impact for our students. And that's the happy place that I have to stand in order to go through some of these tougher discussions that we're having, like the one we're having, tomorrow night about the budget. So there's good news and bad news, right? The good news is across California, the governor and the state have really provided a huge increase in funding for education. And in part, that's thanks to the fact that in California, although the economy might not feel so great on the ground to some people, but it has been really good economy for the tech industry. And because we actually tax rich people in this state more than in maybe some other states, that has meant a lot of revenue for the state of California, and that revenue has come out to our schools and means that we have a healthy fund balance in OUSD. We have a significant cost of living increase, COLA last year. At the same time, there's big challenges in Oakland and across California where enrollment is declining, and so funding declines as a result of that. And we know all of these COVID relief funds and some of the other one-time funds, they're one-time, they come with expiration dates. And so we don't have those forever, and we are going to have to make adjustments as those sunset. And then also inflation is going up, costs are going up, most specifically with benefits, pensions, lots of other things in society have gotten a lot more expensive. And so we just have to reflect that in our budgeting and acknowledge that those costs have changed. One way in which our investments should change is we need to compensate our employees a lot more. You're seeing some headlines here on the slide from different districts where there have been substantial increases to employees, because it's hard to stay here in California unless you get a pay increase. And so districts around the state are taking this new money from the state and investing it in their employees. And we need to be able to do that here in Oakland too. Our pay here in Oakland is much lower than neighboring districts, and it can't stay that way, or else we won't be able to. We're having enough trouble hiring right now as it is. Next year, we get harder and harder and harder unless we give a significant increase to our employees. And so just want to highlight this last point because I referred to the cost of living increase from last year, but for next year or for this coming year, the governor had said it was going to be 8%. But then there's, we're not seeing as good economic times right now, even for you seeing technology layoffs. A lot of the technology sector is hurting right now. And so that means less revenue for the state, which means less money to our schools. And so instead of an 8% increase, there's some in Sacramento right now who are advocating for only a 6.4% or even lower increase in funding for schools. And so I just put the smiling faces of our politician legislators on here. So if you want to reach out to them and let them know that you really prioritize as high of an increase for our schools as possible, I think that's really important because it's going to influence the conversation that we're having tomorrow night at the board. So with that, I don't want to take up a lot of space. So I will pass it over to, oh, no, there was one more piece. Oh, okay. This is my favorite slide. So this is my analogy. We actually have a huge opportunity right now where we are almost out of fiscal receivership. Oh, who are the names on the last slide? So that's Governor Newsom, Assemblymember Mia Bonta, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, and Senator Nancy Skinner. So those are the legislators and the governor for this part of California. So we have a huge opportunity right now where we could actually take our district out of fiscal receivership. So what happened 20 years ago, well, there's many versions of what happened, but basically Oakland Unified took out a big loan from the state in order to pay its bills. And as a consequence, the state came in and took over the district and slowly has given up some control. We're now at the state where, or in the state of affairs where, it's the reason I have this teenager with the car key, it's kind of like we're driving the car, but we always have the county trustee in the passenger seat kind of checking out how we're doing as we drive. So I'll even be talking to the county trustee later tonight because every decision we make as a school board, she has the power to stay or rescind it if she thinks that it's not been properly done in terms of what's fiscally sustainable for us as a district. And so if we want to get that independence, if we want to be able to drive the car in ourselves and really have full control over our district, we need to finish paying off the loan, and then we need to pass a fiscal systems audit. And part of that needs to be the governance of the district needs to show that we are financially responsible with what we're entrusted with, and we're making good decisions for our district. If we crash that car, in other words, if we have a negative balance, then we will lose those car keys for the foreseeable future, and it will be a really bad situation. So we really need to take that very seriously as we're making these decisions, that we are good stewards of the resources that we have. I don't think that's a conservative position. I think that's a very progressive position to take good care of the money that the taxpayers entrust us with. And so that's partly why I want to have this forum, is for us to have that conversation, for the public to be more informed about what we're doing rather than it just happening behind closed doors or in a quick, the board has just decided and that's what's happening. I think that we're much healthier as we have more engagement around these issues. So with that, I will now pass it over to Mr. Troy Christmas. Oh no, I'm passing it back over to Caitlin and Mahogany to give some of the goals and framing questions.
Great, thanks, Sam. So we have a few goals tonight. The first one is to ask the district to clearly communicate information about the budget in plain language so families can understand the decision and advocate for their students' needs. And I think I really appreciate Mahogany last week asking Troy to explain it to how he would explain it to his 4-year-old son, because I've been sitting in these meetings as a PSAC member for 4 years thinking I understand, but maybe I should understand more. And it really helped when she just said, can you please explain it more simply? And it was like, oh, wow, makes a lot more sense. So all that to say, we really want to encourage people to ask questions. And if something doesn't make sense, please put it in the chat. With the goal being to give parents a view into the why and how of the budget decision-making process. I'll pass it over to Mahogany. Oh, you're still on
I'm
mute
muted.
there.
Thank you, Caitlin. Please understand that at the time of this presentation that was created, the district has not yet finalized exactly what budget adjustments will be recommended for tomorrow's meeting. So that means that those questions will not be able to provide answers to you. So if it doesn't mean that you can't ask them, but they won't be answered. Along these lines, our suggestion questions for breakout groups are very simple. So these are the suggested. What is something you learned from this presentation? What, something just came up in the chat, so I gotta wait for that to go away, sorry. What are some questions or wonderings that you still have? So make sure you get as much clarity as you can as possible in this very short window, or whatever questions that you also have. I'm sure that Troy or Mr. Sam Davis, let me put Mr. on both of them. I make you so big, Mr. Davis. That you provide all those questions to them. So don't just cut off any opportunities that you feel like that this isn't the only time. You still can ask those questions either in email as well, if they're not all answered this evening. So thanks to everyone for being here again.
Thanks. And with that, I will pass it over to Mr. DeCarlos Kegler, who's our Chief Financial Officer for Oakland Unified, and Troy Christmas, Senior Director for Strategic Projects. Oops.
Good evening.
Carlos, if you want.
Let me start by unmuting myself. And I'm going to share the screen here. Flop around a little bit. I'm not sure. So, good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be here with you guys. I'm glad we're doing stuff like this. This is a good opportunity for us to connect to the community in a sort of a offline way. The board meetings are sort of structured in a way that you really don't get to ask as many questions as you'd like. So I think this is a good opportunity for a back and forth between the district and communities. I would like to say, though, as I'm going through this, I heard several of you say that you've been looking at this data for a while and you still don't really understand it. I'm here to tell you, give yourselves a break, because I've been doing this for 20 years and most of my colleagues share these sentiments. The state is very fluid. They change rules and regulations like they change pants. And so as soon as you feel like you understand something, they change it. And so it's a very, very fluid budget cycle. I think Director Davis mentioned in a previous slide about the COLA. Our initial COLA was 5.38. By the time we got to January, it was announced that it would be 8.13. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, it could possibly be 6.4. So you think about that magnitude of change in that relatively small amount of time, in addition to just a slew of different other things. So don't be too hard on yourselves. We all just got to hang in there, and it's our job to keep explaining it in a way that you guys can digest it, on a level to where you don't have to be an accountant. So I'm going to go through really quick, just sort of high levels on some of these slides, and other slides I'll get into detail. But if you have specific questions, please mark the slide and we can go back and reference the slide later on. So One of the biggest things that we do at OUSD is our LCAP. Everything is derived around the LCAP, and the strategic plan initiatives are listed here. You'll also find these in the LCAP. Ensuring strong readers by 3rd grade, supporting empowered graduates, creating joyful schools, and number 4, growing a diverse and stable staff. That's one of the ones we've had a tough goal at because Oakland's a really expensive area, and we are, as Director Davis mentioned, we are not high up on the pay scale. And so trying to improve employee pay is one of the things that would directly tie us to growing a diverse and stable staff. Also, the LCAP goals and areas, as you see mentioned here. Number 4, our staff are highly qualified, stable, and reflective of Oakland's rich diversity. Well, if you want that type of staff, you got to pay them, just like with everything else in life, the Mercedes doesn't cost the same as this, and this doesn't cost the same as that. And if you want to retain people, right, if you want to keep good people and grow them, you got to pay them, because if your neighbor's paying them more, they have families to feed. They're going to go next door. So, no one can blame them for trying to better their future. This next slide just sort of details Oakland spends its revenue. So,
sorry, Carlos, can you put it in presentation mode, because people are having a hard time seeing this slide.
Got it. Better?
That's much better. Thank you so much.
Got it. Okay, so
well, you do have some black boxes though. I don't know if you can
that's my rookie here. Let's see. There you go. Do this. Sit you guys over there.
Thank you.
Better? I know it's probably cutting off the top, but so this is just a look at our overall expenditures by category, and you can see of the total 750 million, 550 is spent directly on staff, for 73%. Very common for public schools. In fact, 73% is pretty low. It's not uncommon to see schools hover around 85%, but you can see what we spend relative to that budget. 129 million in other operating services, 56 million in books and supplies. But the bulk of that is in staffing and salaries. And so if you're trying to get a particular number, if that number gets pretty large, then your adjustments have to include some staffing, because you just don't have enough expenses elsewhere to make set amount of cuts. So good news right now in California is that over the last 2 years, we've received the highest COLA in a 2-year period, probably in 50 years, maybe even in the state's history. And as a result of the increased COLA, we also received a ton of one-time money as a result of the pandemic. And so when we were receiving these monies, it allowed us to kind of build up our unrestricted fund balance, because we were allowed to use those monies that sort of crossed purposes. And so we were using the one-time funds, and it allowed our fund balance to build up. And so couple reasons for the good news is this board and this staff has made some really difficult decisions over the past 5 years, in addition to the high state levels and the one-time money from COVID and other sources. This is the contra of the previous slide, right? Previous slide, all good news. This one is not so good news. This is showing our ADA and enrollment. And what you're going to notice is, if you look at the 18-19 year, you're going to see a huge drop in ADA to enrollment. And that's not unlike any other school, right? We're during the pandemic. But as we started to recover through 19 and 20, 2021, we're starting again to go the other way. And if you look at the delta between our enrollment for last year and our actual ADA, it's about 4,000 kids. That's pretty significant, considering we are funded on ADA. They call it butts and seats. It's not your enrollment. I mean, things would be great if we were funded here, but we're not. We're funded there. A couple other things that we'll touch on the next slide relative to this is, in addition to the district receiving one-time funds and an increased COLA, as a result of the pandemic, we also received an ADA relief, which allowed us to use the higher of the prior 3 years to current year of the last year. Well, that average is catching up to us, and soon we're going to be at the average of our existing 3 years. And so there's really no relief there. But just to give you an example of how school district funding works, this slide does a really good idea. These numbers are used to illustrate the math, right? These aren't actual numbers. In OUSD, our teachers average about 104,000 per year, including benefits. And we also receive a little bit more in per student ADA. But if you just look at the math, if you think about it, if we were to receive 200 students next year, the way most California schools are funded is teacher to student ratio in the classroom. And so 20-to-1 is a pretty average ratio of student to teacher through K-12. It just depends on what grade, but if you took an average. So if you had 200 less kids, that would equate to about 10 less teachers at 20 kids per class, but that only amounts to $800,000 at 80,000 per teacher. While if we're receiving 14,000 and we lose 200, that's 2.8. So even though we lay off those 20 teachers relative to the class sizes, we still have an additional 2 million to cut. Our challenge ahead, sustainable ongoing investment. So the projected surplus and our projections are insufficient to make the following ongoing investments. And if you click in the strategic plan, it'll give you more detail, but invest tens of millions of dollars to better retain and equip teachers as indicated in the strategic plan. That's exactly what we're all talking about, paying better so that we can keep good, strong teachers, especially after we mold them and we make them into something and then, they just fly out the door. If we were able to offer more attractive payment packages, I think that would help us keep some of them around. Maintain financial and operational sustainability. That's critical in public schools, because especially like Oakland, where a lot of your infrastructure is older, it oftentimes requires more work and more service. And with that, I will pass it over to Mr. Christmas.
Great. Director Davis, can you go back and drive for me?
Yeah, just a sec.
Sure. And we can pull up the slide before that, actually. And good evening. My name is Troy Christmas. I'm currently Director of Strategic Projects in the district, which has me explaining things that I had to learn firsthand 20 years ago or 19 years ago when I started at the district with no background in education, but lots of background in finance and law. So yeah, we can start. No, one more before that. Great. So what you heard Mr. Kegler talk about in terms of our need to invest tens of millions of dollars to better retain staff. You heard him say we have a budget of $750 million. So we operate roughly, if you include some other funds that aren't included in that 750, the 750 is our general fund. We have other funds for child nutrition, adult ed. I saw some adult ed teachers in the room, and early childhood. We are a $1 billion organization. And as a $1 billion organization, a 1% salary increase is tens of millions of dollars, or 5% salary increase is tens of millions of dollars. And so to make the kind of adjustments we need to do to keep pace with our neighboring districts, because we have to keep pace. We like to think of ourselves in sort of just only ourselves, but we are actually competing for talent, just like every other organization is competing for talent. And in order to do that, we have to make major shifts because we're such a large organization that employs so many people that what may seem as minor changes cost tens of millions of dollars. So we can go to the next slide. So a perennial, I'll say, since I've been here, the entire 19 years, one of the questions has been, can we solve this by cutting central office? And many people don't know what central office is, but in school districts, there is a divide typically of things that are at the school and things that aren't at the school. And so central office is seen as something that's not at the school. That's not quite 100% accurate, but that's certainly how people have viewed things over this 19-year period and long before. And so when we hit the financial crisis, two of the common critiques were we're spending too much on contracts and consultants, and we have too much management. And so that's where you can find the money to do what you need to do. And so the question is, are those still concerns today? Certainly lots of people concerned about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about what information is available to help us determine where we can find the funds to do what we need to do and sort of how that process has gone. So we can go to the next slide. So on consultants, because this question has come up so many times, we've created like data sets and dashboards for people to look at it. But when compared to other districts, there's a category called professional consulting services and operating expenditures. That's a category shared by all school districts in California because we have a standardized accounting structure. Oakland spends more in that category than most other districts, certainly more than average. And this is because in those contracts, we have many contracts with community partners that provide direct services to students. We have contracts with service providers that provide direct services to students, whether that be for transportation or for students with disabilities or after school programs. And those all fall under professional consulting services and other operating expenditures. And we spend more on that than other districts. And so if you want to see those in great detail, there's a link in the document, and I know that the document here, if it's not been made public in the chat, will be. You can see exactly what those vendors are, exactly what those expenditures are, and so the vast majority of them are services to students the same way our staff provide services to students. In 2021, that total central office contracts that were ones essentially purchased through central office were $16.4 million. You can go inside the dashboard and see all the detail, but that's what it was at that time. It's grown since we've gotten pandemic resources, but on a relative scale to schools relative to central office, it's pretty similar. We can go to the next slide. On the staffing side, here is a snapshot of our staffing. So what you heard Mr. Kegler say is of the $750 million in general fund expenditures, $550 million of that was staff, which is 73% of that $750 million. This slide shows how that's broken down. And so this graphic is created by software, which keeps the rectangles sized relative to the dollar numbers that you see there. And so management at schools is $32.8 million. Non-management at schools is the bulk of our staffing costs, $327 million. Non-management at Central is the next largest group at $140 million. And management at Central is at $49.4 million. That's for this year. The FTE numbers, full-time equivalent numbers for the employees are from the previous year because it's actually very complicated to do it for current year, but on a relative basis, they are similar, even though those are not the exact numbers. But that's where the money is being spent on staffing. If you go to the next slide. And so because this has been a perennial issue over the last several years, we have been seeking to reduce the size of management. And so that's what the bar chart shows. What the bar chart doesn't show is the local control funding formula, which we get the vast majority of our funding from, was growing up until around 2018. So way back when in the recession, pre-local control funding formula, the state came in and said, we've been underfunding school districts. We're going to start funding them better, and we're going to catch up to our underfunding. We're going to catch up by 2018 or so. And so those funds were growing, and all staff was growing. Around 2017-18, the funding flattened out, and you start talking about cost of living allowances, COLA, because it's only growing by that COLA percentage. And during that time, you'll see the management staff going down. If you see the overall staff number was going up because we were spending more money on non-management staff. And you'll see this little bump in 22, and that's when the pandemic-related funds started coming in, and those numbers have grown for 2 years because we've had a lot more one-time money, which is beginning to go away. And so that's sort of what's happened with management. Again, this has been a perennial question. So we created a dashboard for people to go and they can see all the different positions, position types, management, whether it's school or not school, all that information is there. Go to the next one. And so as we're looking at Our challenge is that we don't have tens of millions of new dollars to make the kind of investments we need to make in staff retention. So that means we have to take the pie that we have now and divide it differently. And so in order to divide it differently, we need to go and look for, and what districts and what finance people like DeCarlos and me would do is we look for where is money and where is money in this district differently than money in other districts. And so these are some of the areas where money is differently spent in this district than in others. We have higher or lower staffing ratios, which means we have more adults per student than many other districts. And there's lots of information about that, and there's been lots of discussion about that. We have more schools than many other districts. And so as a finance person, you're looking to find where are you different and where can you find the resources to make the investments you want to make. We have more site autonomy, which is a wonderful thing, but it has costs and consequences to it. And we also provide, as I mentioned, it says equitable service, but we invest heavily in newcomers and students with disabilities in terms of relative to the funding that we get specifically for those students. We invest more, which is something that Oakland does different. These are commitments that we have that a finance person would say we need to look at these commitments, but because there are commitments, those are set aside as sort of doors we're not trying to go through. We need to try to find the funds for make our investments elsewhere. And so that's what the challenge is. And so if you can go to the next slide. So what we've looked at and what's going to be discussed tomorrow at the board meeting is making these adjustments that we need to make in these areas. So repurposing some central LCFF supplemental funds. What does that mean? That means we have some of the funds designated to improve services for our foster youth, for our students who are low income, and for our students who are English language learners. We have some funds that are designated to help improve outcomes for those students that are controlled or distributed centrally. And we're looking at repurposing what those funds are used for in order to make the investments we want to make. Reduction in central services of schools. That's essentially a reduction mostly in staff. So we're 73% staff. If you're going to reduce services to free up resources, you're going to be reducing staff in central services. Shift central services to one-time resources. So we mentioned that we have an abundance of one-time resources that have come in as a result, primarily pandemic-related resources. Some of them are flexible enough to temporarily shift services that are being paid with other funds into these one-time resources, really to what I would call it buy time. And what I mean by that is when those one-time resources are gone, whatever we shift there is going to be gone as well, unless during that intervening time, which is 1 to 2 years, the board and staff come up with a alternative plan. And so anything you see that's being shifted to a one-time resource, that means unless and until it is moved into another resource, it will go away when that one-time resource expires. Elimination of vacant positions. We have a number of vacant positions that have stayed vacant, and we're looking at alternatives of meeting those needs. Sometimes that's through contractors, sometimes that's additional work for existing employees, and sometimes that means that work just doesn't get done. And so we're looking at eliminating vacant positions, which will free up resources. And the last is reduction in school discretionary positions. And the way this works is when inflation happens, just like in your household, when a school gets its budget and it has its discretionary money to spend, if it spends it on staff, it's buying or paying for the staff based on the cost of that staff. As the cost of that staff goes up, they're able to buy fewer, or they're able to hire fewer staff members. And so that is also going to create the resources or free up resources to put towards that higher cost of staffing. And that's what happens when you invest in compensation. So those are the areas that are going to be discussed. There'll be much more detail. As some folks have mentioned, the attachments for the meeting tomorrow have now been posted. They were posted earlier today. And so that detail is becoming available and people are digesting it. But this is the areas and the types of things that we're looking at. And I think that's a point for us to pause. I'm right. The next slide. Oh, next steps, tomorrow's meeting. Do want to advise people. I saw a lot of staff members when I looked at the participants, a lot of people I've known for almost, some of you more than these 19 years working with the district. The normal process is the board votes on the adjustments, and that kicks off noticing of employees of position eliminations. And then we have our budget update, which will incorporate the reductions that the board votes on. And then the ultimate the board adopts the budget for next year and the local control accountability plan in June. I think that with that, we're ready for breakouts and questions. There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Christmas and Mr. Kaler. Ms. Talkington, do you want to walk us through the breakout rooms, or do you want me to do that?
I can do that for you. So hi, everybody. I am Jody Talkington. We're in the superintendent office. I'm supporting with some facilitation and also your tech host for tonight. So what we're going to do, I'm sure you have lots of questions. Thanks for everyone who put it in the chat. I'm recording those, saving those. We are going to go first to breakout sessions and hopefully discussing with other folks in the meeting, hearing what questions other people will have. Will get you even more focused for the Q&A session that we'll have when we come back from breakouts. So don't worry if your question in the chat hasn't been answered. We're going to come back to questions after breakouts. The purpose of the breakouts are first for you to get a chance. What's one thing you learned from the presentation? Allow you to share that with each other. Also, what are some of the questions or wonderings you still have? There are 2 volunteers who signed up to be note takers for your breakout. And so those note takers should have access to the document, and they're going to write down all your questions as well. When you come back to the whole group, we want to hear from each breakout room. There are 8 breakout rooms. So pay attention to which room you go in, because I'm going to ask each of the breakout rooms to share a summary of their questions that will lead us through our whole group Q&A time. And as Mahogany said at the beginning, whatever questions we don't get to tonight, we can follow up with Vice President Davis. You can continue to email him. You can go to the board meeting tomorrow night, and we'll also try to get out additional responses to questions if we aren't able to get to all of them tonight. So those are the instructions for your breakouts. I'm going to Q&A portion of the meeting, which we'll move right into. So welcome back. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of our meeting. And so how we're going to do this is we'll start out with hearing from each of the breakout rooms, of which there were 8. And I would love either the note taker or somebody you appointed in your group to share out 1 or 2 of the top questions that came up in your group. Don't worry, all of them, your note taker should have written all of them down, or you can write additional questions in the chat, which we will save as well. So we're going to hear all the questions first. We won't answer them right away. We're just going to hear them, and then we'll pass to staff or board or Vice President Davis. Oh, sorry. Director Davis to answer the questions that come up in this space. And then any of the ones we're not able to answer, we will track and get out to the public. And also remember, there's a meeting tomorrow. Okay, so first, let's hear from room number 1. And I believe the note takers for that space were Kira Mungia and Gail Wallace. If you want to share a couple of the questions, again, we'll just read them out. Hear them in the room. That way you can say, yeah, we had the same question or not. And then we'll go to answering after we hear from each group.
I'll just say shout out to group 1 for your really engaging conversation and questions. And thank you, Gail, for taking such detailed notes. I'll try to go quickly, but Gail, please let me know if there's anything that I missed. I think that there were 3 general themes for questions. One that a lot of folks had is around funding sources and additional funding, especially for students kind of furthest from opportunity and highest need. So our newcomers, our students in special education, et cetera. And then can we also support efforts so that funding is around enrollment instead of attendance? And are we, like looking to the county, to the state, other opportunities for more funding like some other districts do as well? There's also a request for even more transparency and breakdown of which departments have contracts. And then also just continued questions and wanting more clarity around school closures. Is that still something that's on the table? It seems like it continues to be brought up. So I think those were kind of the three main buckets, but Gail, please correct me or add or edit.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize I needed to unmute again.
Thank you, Gail and Kira and group one. Group number two, we had Maura and Jana helping out with that group. When do you want to share out the key questions that came up there?
Of course, I'm on mute. Key questions. I think there was a lot of questions around equity, like how are we taking equity into account? Just how is equity driving the decisions? Is there a way to think about equity when making the cuts and making sure that the most impacted students are like the least impacted by the budget cuts? Equity around whose voice are we getting to hear? Like where's the student voice in these decisions on the budget cuts? Is there a process of getting more youth voice and community voice in the process? There was also questions around just like site leadership, and that's like handed from central office, and how do we compare to other districts that are like successful with students who are also like our target groups and traditionally marginalized? Can we get like some best practices from other districts and what they're doing better? Like can UC Berkeley and Cal and all those, whatever other universities are around here, can they like also do research with us to help us? And also questions around like, like noticing like the cuts that are happening, since RJ is on the strategic plan, are they, as we're hearing that like vacancies are going to stay vacant and they're not going to like be filled in, are there plans to helping schools pay for like RJ staff at sites, just knowing that like RJ is a really big commitment, and it's also super helpful to our sites. So those are just some of our highlighted questions.
Great, thank you, group two. Group three, we have Viola and Pat who helped out with facilitating and note-taking. Do you want to share some themes or key questions?
Pat, if you could read the questions for us. You're muted.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. Let me get the notes. So a couple of questions around the school closures and the vote that changed in January, what the ramification of that is. Another question about the reserves, what's the maximum amount of money we could take from there and use in the district? Another question, what's the impact on the 24-25 budget when the one-time money is gone? Because it looks like we're okay for 2 years, but what about going forward? And if we can get competitive salaries, what other factors are important for retention? Does the district do any exit interviews? What's the current research on important retention factors? And then again on the school closures. That was it.
I think there was a remark about I think early on we saw a presentation of the difference between the enrollment and attendance, the truancy. What is the district doing around truancy?
Oh, sorry. I thought that was with school closures. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, group three. Group four, we had Trisha Johnson and Sharon Rose. We hear some themes or a summary there.
Yeah, one parent wished that the central office question had addressed an update about the lease of the expensive office downtown, since that's an important part of that expense area. There was a question about services funded by COVID money. What will we lose? What is going away? We know that some things are going away, and what are they? Like more clarity about that. Probably the most important question is, can we advocate to change the formula? If the state and the county have surpluses, why are schools struggling so hard? The attendance and enrollment formula is hurting. kids in districts. So, and then just hard to get the full picture of the budget and the way that the district presents it so late in the game before the board has to vote, and families wish they had more time to digest the information and talk about it with the district, their board members, community members, before the board has to vote. And I would imagine the board members feel similarly. They would have liked to have a little more time to digest it. So, and just a lot of positive feeling about this type of event, and want to see more of this and see it advertised more widely, because it would have been nice to have even more parents here, and maybe that can happen at the next one. Oh, and last, just confusion about, like, if we reverse the school closures, what does that mean for the budget? People are hearing a lot of confusion among parents talking about that, and they just want to understand that better.
Right, thank you, Group 4. Group 5 was Caitlin and Troy. I'm gonna share a summary of what came up for your group.
Yeah, thanks. A lot similar to Group 4. Just really wondering the actual cuts, which ties into this crazy timeline. The fact that the board got the information, the public got it today, and it's being voted on tomorrow is completely ridiculous in trying to have any type of community engagement. We have, 60 people here tonight for a district that serves, 32,000 kids. And this is the only look we're getting into maybe these proposed cuts. In Group 5, there happened to be 3 PSAC members, and we all know how hard we have worked to put on, meetings like this, where we really spend lots of hours trying to help inform the budget. We're tasked as PSAC members to give feedback on the budget and the LCAP, but this is a timeline that's so ridiculous. So why is this timeline the way it is? And how can we make sure it doesn't happen in the future? Because it would be nice to hear, what are we cutting? And then what are we proposed cutting? And from there, then we could give feedback on that. And also echoing, this has been a great use of time having forums like that. We hope that other board members can step up and do it. It shouldn't feel like this is a D1 thing. All the board members should be taking turns hosting events like that for the whole community. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. There's a few more in the note takes, but I'll pass it off to Group 6.
Right, thank you, Caitlin, and Group 5. Group 6, Mahogany and Edward.
Hey, Edward, note taker here. We did have questions that echo some of what's already been said, like who was surveyed to determine which positions to eliminate, like what was the conversation around that. There's confusion around the chronically vacant position cuts and wondering are there costs associated with unfilled positions. There were questions around the debt and just the history of that. One participant understood that OUSD was forced into a loan essentially by Jerry Brown and Don Parada. We had a $30 million budget shortfall and we were forced to take on $100 million debt. And why couldn't we have used construction loans to pay for that shortfall in the short term? For non-management position, a lot of money goes out to non-district vendors that are inherently for-profit. Why is the district outsourcing public sector jobs to for-profit companies? Even if they're less expensive, some of that money goes to profit margins, not to our public service employees. There were questions around charters, like how do charter schools affect our budgets? As simple as that. And I have wondered what's the process for charter school renewal, because I saw in the chat that 8 schools are up for renewal. And then someone asked, is it necessary to have a principal? Like if it's a school full of qualified teachers, is that a necessary position? You know, and also there was a lot of sentiment, just people liking this format and wanting more of what we're doing here. So thank you.
Thank you, Group 6. Group 7 had Katie and DeCarlos. Want to give a summary?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks to Group 7. I'll just say that a number of folks shared that what they learned was needing to call the elected representatives. So that came up. I know that wasn't part of the question for the report back. Just wanted to share it because a number of people shared that. And then in terms of the questions that came up, one was just why we don't have more money in terms of property taxes and the resourcing for our schools. So like, what are the underlying conditions that are creating that situation? Another person was talking about there were a lot of questions that came up around the timelines for budgeting in relationship relative to the timelines for bargaining with staff. And so, you know, how to align that? Why is that so misaligned? One question also came up in regards to families, parents being at the table in that process and wanting to make sure that families are there. How does that happen? And a question about whether dates could be aligned in terms of when the budget information comes in and when the timing of negotiations is happening in order to be able to be more responsive. And then finally, a question just around the process, like where are we actually at in the process? I think this aligns with what I heard from a lot of the other groups, like how were the proposals developed? How have they already been put in? You know, what's happening with this process for proposing the cuts and voting on them?
Thank you, Group 7. And the last group was Sam and Jennifer. You can give a summary of Group 8.
Thanks. And just it's nice I got to put myself last because I get to just appreciate all the groups and just amazing questions and creative ideas, and just love to hear people thinking outside of the box. And this is what we need more of, so we can just have these free form conversations where it's a lot more of a constructive and positive vibe generally than we have at our school board meetings, where it's kind of us versus them. So I just really appreciate the tone that everyone is bringing tonight. And some of the questions we heard were just from some of the school site councils, the challenge of losing ESSER funds for next year. And are there other one-time funds that could be plugged in there instead? I think another question, definitely heard the same question about equity as we're going through this process. How are we making sure to center equity in terms of what the impact is going to be on different school sites? I think there was a question about the breakdown of expenses across different central office departments. And I just encourage everyone to spend some time studying the slides. There's a lot of slides in the appendix to the deck. And one of those is actually a breakdown of all the expenses across different central office departments. There was a question about, I think at one point it was referred to 104,000 as the average teacher salary. And just to clarify, that's salary plus benefits. And so the average teacher salary is a lot lower than that. But then there's all the additional expenses that come along with you know, benefits and pension and other costs in a paycheck. Just another question, I've heard that a few times, of whether it's more expensive to contract out services rather than doing them in-house, because aren't other nonprofits or for-profit entities even more expensive than doing the costs in-house as a district. And I think the last point that was made was not a question, but more of a statement, was just, and I absolutely agree that when we're talking about compensation, we tend to focus on teacher salaries, but this is actually about compensation increases for all district employees. Some of our lowest paid employees are classified employees, and they really need support. And we're having trouble even filling some of those positions because we don't pay them enough. And so just trying to see our salaries go up across the board for all positions. And I think that was the biggest point that I heard. And now I will definitely pass it back to Ms. Talkington and see where we can go from here. Get some answers.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is try to get through everything I heard here, and then I'll go back to the chat. And then depending on the remaining time, we can, if we have remaining time, take questions. So keep putting them in the chat, because again, if we don't answer, we will follow up. So first I want to start, and I will direct it toward certain folks, primarily either you, Sam, DeCarlos, or Troy, but then feel free to pass it around to someone else. So the first question, I heard a lot of questions about the process. Where are we at in the timeline for budget development, and how were decisions made, and looking at equity, and how are like priorities and suggestions for elimination. So I'm wondering if Sam, you want to start with that and then maybe pass to Troy?
I mean, I definitely asked that question in closed session. Am I allowed to say what I was told? You're going to give me permission. I think what I definitely heard from staff was that because I asked that question, I was really concerned about the timeline and how short of a time window we were being given as board members to make these decisions. And we had some of these discussions in closed session, but still it's a really rapid turnaround. And what I heard from staff was just concern that they had been trying to move this process along earlier, but then with the rescission of school closures, they ended up having to go and reallocate all of the school site budgets based on, changing the enrollment projections for all of the schools for next year, and just what the impact that had on all the school budgets. And so that slowed them down on getting this process moving earlier, where we would have liked to have had a couple board meetings and a more, gradual process. But because of how quick the change was, that really impacted the timeline for this decision.
Thank you. Troy or DeCarlos, do you want to add anything, maybe a little bit more here about what you know about how the decisions were made related to like prioritization and any equity factors? That was a question that came up.
Well, I'm going to wholeheartedly agree with everyone that this was very fast. And so a lot of the information that's being requested were stuff that, we had to calculate manually and kind of figure out in a large quantity in a relatively small amount of time. Part of the reason is the way California schools for both classified and certificated now is we have to notify March 15th, but there's a lot more steps that go into that. That's when the employee receives the notice. But if you back into that March 15th date, you have to have time to identify. You have to have time to look at the bumping. And bumping is a public school system of, I would call it seniority, right? You've been here longer, and a person's position, if your position gets bumped, and a lot of times you can bump a person that hasn't been here as long as you. It's just kind of a simple way of explaining it. That also takes time. And so in order for us to be able to make that March 15th date, we have to start way sooner. And because of the school rescissions, like Director Davis said, we were smack dead in the middle of this. So all of that got put on hold. We dealt with the situations with the schools closures being reversed. But then we had to go back and redo all the budget sessions, because the budget sessions had been completed with those schools not in the calculations. And so once those schools are brought back online, all of the sessions that we had done for all of the schools that were impacted needed to be redone. So everything needed to be repacked, recalibrated, and then brought back to the forefront. I also mentioned in our breakout room is the timing. And so we did not want to bring anything to the board or present anything without having the full proposal from OEA. And so we initially were getting proposals in sort of pieces. And so it does you no good to start developing a budget based on a piece of information. We wanted the whole package so we can look at it in its entirety and assess, how best to fund it, what we can fund, and sort of pretty much along those lines.
I wanted to just add a couple of things for simplicity as you think about school districts and Oakland in specific. In January of every year, the governor gives you an idea of his projection or proposed budget for the following year. that's money coming in, right? A budget is just money coming in and money coming out. So in January, you start getting an idea of money coming in. And then for money going out, you have to project what are the investments that I want to make and how big. And DeCarlos mentioned something about that. That also is impacted by who your board is, and we seated a new board. Okay, so that's January. On the other side, you have the March 15th noticing if you're going to change anything with staff. And I can tell you our human resources department is going to be flipping out at getting information as late as February 28th. So February 28th is absolutely pushing it. But the squeeze is between January 10th and the end of February. All this stuff has to get done if you're going to make these kinds of major shifts in a given year. And so that is something that we face frequently when we try to make big shifts in a given year. And the question that came up in our small group was, how do you get out of that? And the way you get out of that is you make your plans over multiple years. So you don't have to do everything. Yes, there's a 4-year-old who's decided to jump in here with me. You don't try to do everything between January 10th and the end of February.
Okay. So I'm going to do, I know there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to lump together a lot that I heard from all of the groups. One group of questions was really about funding sources. Like, can you explain more what our different funding sources are? Why doesn't the district have more funds given the state surplus? And kind of funding about the ESSER funds going away. So if we could get a little bit of summary of like, what are, maybe explaining a little bit of the ongoing funds, the one-time funds, where does our funding come from? And then another, I just want to mention the other question I'm going to go to, if we can hit these two in the remaining time at least, is really about, there are tons of questions about school closures, including coming up in the chat, like what was the amount that we were going to save or not saving? Is it still on the table? Is it not still on the table? Those kinds of things. But let's go to the funding sources first, just so we have that. So I'm wondering if Troy or DeCarlos, if you could explain, and again, I know there's a lot of information in the slides and the appendix, so this is just high level. What are the main funding sources, and maybe explaining a little bit about the ongoing and one time, since there was that ESSER question too.
No, that's a great question. And I can kind of frame it relatively, kind of in short. Enrollment, ADA loss. If we were not receiving the relief from the state, we would be in dire straits right now. Reason being is, if you remember the slide during the presentation, right? The 14,000 per kid, 20 per, if you were to take that into context, we have lost an ADA from 2021 to current, an ADA, actual butts and seats, that's what we get paid on, over 4,000 kids. I believe if you go to that slide and you do the math, it's like 4,100 kids. So if you quantify that by $14,000, which is a lot less than we get per ADA, think about the impact of that. Think about that is a huge number. In addition to that, we have a slew of one-time money that is coming to an end, right? And so you can do a lot with that one-time money one time, but you can't put it on a salary schedule. You can't pay ongoing salaries. And so if this were a situation where we can say, hey, we just load you up one time and then we move on with our lives, this would be a lot easier, but it's not, because it's part of the fund balance, but it's no longer available. Once you use it, there's no replenishment of it. And so you have to be careful of how you spend it and how you promise it. And then there was a question about the school closures, I believe. That is going to take some time just to work through. I'll be honest with you guys. There are original numbers out there, but nothing I would be safe at this time. Like, it's just that target is still moving.
And then you can also explain in the resolution for tomorrow. So the target in terms of what savings, the savings that would have been from the closures that got rescinded. And then also, Sam, I see you answer in the chat. Can you share not about closures, but about mergers and how they're part of the resolution the board has to vote for tomorrow?
I mean, I have to be totally honest that I only got that proposal this afternoon, so it's pretty new to me as well. It's as new to me as it slightly less new to me than it is to everybody else on this call, but it's not something that I was expecting. So no, I don't have any answer to that.
Okay, just clarifying that, okay. And then moving to some of the other questions, I'm going to try to get in some questions that I didn't bucket together, but that seemed a little like there is some clear answers to. So one, there was a question about the lease at 1000 Broadway, and what's the status there, and will the district still have to pay for that? Sam, would you mind responding to that one?
Yeah, that one I'm fully informed on. So there was a proposal to extend the lease. So I think the lease ends, am I right, Jody, it ends in March of 2024?
August 2023.
August, yeah, it ends in August of this year. And so the proposal was to extend it until March of 2024. And the board did not vote for that. I think there was I'll just speak for myself. I felt like we've extended it many, many times in the past. And it seemed like no matter what happens with the building in West Oakland, that's going to be the new central office at Cole, that there will not be, that's not going to be finished in time for staff to move directly in there from 1000 Broadway, because that's probably not going to be finished until about June of 2024. So there was going to be a lapse anyway. And so to me, it just made sense that if we were going to have a period of having central office be fully remote, that we might as well do it for all of next school year. So staff is going to be moving out of 1000 Broadway completely by the end of spring. And then we'll be fully remote for next school year. And then we'll be moving into Cole for the following year. So Cole is, just for people who don't know, so Cole, there's the old Cole building, which is being torn down. And then there's a new Cole building, which is currently under construction and will be there that's supposed to be finished by June of next year, if everything goes according to plan. But, construction sometimes is delayed. So I didn't feel like it made sense to keep paying rent at 1000 Broadway forever. So that will be going away as of August.
Another question coming up, DeCarlos and Troy, can you explain the vacancies that are being proposed for eliminations and how it relates to teachers? Because there's a lot of questions in that, clarifying that teachers won't lose the number of teachers that are assigned to them per their student enrollment, but which vacancies are part of the adjustments and how that works out?
That is included on the presentation that Director Davis mentioned. But there's a couple ways of looking at this. Some vacant positions hit the budget because they're a requirement of that funding, right? If you get a grant or you get some ESSER funds, they say you have to hire a counselor, you have to hire a certificated teacher, you have to hire this. And so while they are FTEs and ads, they are a condition of us receiving those funds. It's a different than sort of just adding an FTE to the unrestricted general fund. Also, what you'll see is positions that we've been trying to fill for a long time, and for whatever reason, like everyone else during, what has been a sort of a hiring crisis over the last couple of years, we haven't been able to fill. And so we have to budget for the position. So the position is represented in our financials. But if we're trying to recruit, finally it doesn't pay. A lot of times, because provisions require us to do so, we'll have to outsource that work, right? And that's what a lot of you guys were talking about with some of the outsourcing. A lot of times that's a condition of if a, say for a certain program, if a kid requires a certain service or a certain piece of equipment, and we don't have that service in-house, we're still obligated to provide that service for the kid.
The only other thing I would add, two things really quickly. One, we have staffing ratios that are both by law and contract And so to the extent that we have vacancies that are associated with that staffing, we're still going to be hiring for that staffing because we have obligations. And actually, you mentioned the other thing, which is about, there was a question about, do these vacancies have other costs? And Mr. Kegler was identifying, yes, in some cases, we're required to go find that service in some other way. In other cases, we choose to go find that service. So there may be a vacancy where we're eliminating the vacancy, but that doesn't mean our costs are zero. We have to go get that service provided in some other way, or pay existing staff additional funds to provide some portion of that service, that kind of thing.
And also from, when you think about it, if you're doing cuts, right? If you're trying to have the least impact on class and you're trying to do it effectively and efficiently, it's a lot easier to cut a vacancy than it is a person that you have to notify and set up COBRA and do all of this, right? A vacancy will have the same impact on the budget because it's reflected in the budget with a lot less tension in trying to alleviate that FTE once there's a body in place.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we are at 7 o'clock. I think staff were willing to take a few more questions. And so I think some of them have been answered in the chat from the original questions that were in there before breakouts. Tried to address some of the larger questions or buckets or themes that came out from your breakout groups. So maybe let's take 5 more minutes. About to answer a few more questions, and I see one coming up in the chat that was sort of a theme too. Can we speak to the engagement, like how much has been shared with school sites so far on these eliminations? What is a process to share, or what's been the involvement in the budget development with school sites around this budget process?
They are involved, but not because essentially the way this is sort of being rolled out is it's an attempt for the district to pay our employees more. And so we didn't roll it out to say, you have to cut this amount. We rolled it out to say, can you make this amount of adjustments to get to this number, and gave them the autonomy to choose how they wanted to get to that number. And so in some cases, you may have people who had enough discretionary funds. Discretionary funds are funds that don't involve employment. So it's like, services, there might be professional development, meetings and things like that. And so you'll have a situation where they will opt to cut those expenses as not to affect any employees, any FTEs. And then you had other scenarios where that budget only had salary and benefits. There was no other place to make adjustments. And so in those cases, we had people get really creative. In some cases, they try to find another place to fund it, right? And so if the cost forced them to say, I have to reduce that position by 0.2 FTE, they may have reduced it in that funding source, but they picked it up elsewhere. They use carryover, they use PTA funds, they use another grant that would allow it. But also solicitation of more funding. So it's not just cuts, although in some cases there's not anything else you can do, but how they got there was sort of, up to site leader and the staff and the team.
I wanted to just try to break this one down a little bit more because I heard a little bit more in the question. So every year, our school sites get discretionary funds. And every year they get an allocation of staff that they don't have any choice. They get the allocation of staff based on the number of students. So they have discretion over the discretionary funds. Now, inflation happens every year too. And so we put in the budget a inflationary amount that was in some ways an estimate of what we're expecting to have in terms of personnel inflation, staffing costs. Because of that inflation and the budget that they receive, schools may, depending on what their budget was, have to make adjustments to keep the same staffing that they had this year. And DeCarlos went through all the details of how they would do that. The allocated staff, they're just allocated. But if that staff is going to cost more, that money has to come from somewhere. And that's what we've been talking about. How are we going to afford the increase in cost for all that allocated staff? That's part of what the discussion is about. So schools get discretion over some of it. The other piece was schools are looking at their budget as well as services provided by central office. And when we have time, what schools want to know every year in December, what are the central services I'm going to have so that as I'm doing my budgeting, I can say, okay, I can count on this central service while I'm doing my budgeting so I can use my money elsewhere accordingly. This year, as we've been trying to work with these reductions in central spending to cover the lion's share of what we're trying to do, they didn't have that insight. They didn't have that insight into what is Central going to be able to offer. And we still don't, until the vote happens tomorrow, they still don't know for sure what's actually going to be offered or not offered. And that is the nature of trying to land both planes at the same time with the timeframes that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Another question that I'm seeing in the chat, and also I know came up in the groups, was around vacancies. I know we talked about vacancies and I asked it again, but can you share if there's been any analysis on long-term vacancies and how, if they're not filled, just how we're assessing some of the impact on the vacancies?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. Like,
And I imagine there's different types, some vacancies that perhaps the position, it wasn't filled and they're able to still deliver the services. Others, there was a really needed position, but just in the challenge of hiring that just all districts across the state are having, perhaps it was a very important position, but we're talking about elimination of all vacancies. So is there any nuance to the vacancies?
We're not talking about elimination of all vacancies. We had to sort of identify which ones were eligible to be. Like I said, some of them are a requirement. We actively recruit and try and hire for the position, but whether we can hire for it or not, we have to budget it. We have to be able to fund it and pay for it. And a lot of that you'll see as it relates to supplemental and concentration dollars. Like supplemental and concentration dollars are earned by a certain demographic of students, right? It's supplemental. It's in excess of what you earn from the base, but it comes in through our unrestricted revenue stream. However, it's treated as restricted because even if that targeted demographic of students if they don't use it in the current budgetary year, we don't just get to carry it over and sweep it to the general fund. That money goes back to those kids to be redistributed in the next fiscal year, and it has to be reflected in the LCAP.
The other thing I would say about vacancies is all of these adjustments are listed with a summarized version of an impact statement of making that reduction. So I would encourage folks to look at the board agenda for tomorrow, look at those summarized impact statements, and then be present to ask questions about the considerations that went into the balancing that any kind of reductions like this involve. Any kind of reductions like this involve very complex balancing. And so I am not the expert on that, and this is not the forum, but tomorrow is. So I would encourage you to ask those questions.
And just to clarify, we're not talking about like teacher vacancies in a classroom where it's like, oh, we're having trouble hiring a teacher for this class. That doesn't mean that we then eliminate that teacher position. We still need to hire a teacher at that position. A lot of these are central positions that are vacant. And I don't know if you want to say anything about
central services to sites mostly. This go around we really worked hard not to impact school sites. So we looked very aggressively at central office before even, considering anything else.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jody, or Ms. Talkington, and Mr. Christmas and Mr. Kegler. I think maybe we'll stop there because I do want to respect everybody's time. And I'll just close by saying I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their evenings to attend something like this. I think I'm glad we did it over Zoom. I know it's sometimes better to do these things in person, but Zoom does allow a lot more people to participate and for people to be listening while they're driving and for us to record it and everything. So I think it was worthwhile doing it that way. And I will be trying to have more events like this because I appreciate everybody being so constructive and collaborative and us having a really good conversation. And people are really trying to understand this really complex material. And I think the big picture is we have drastically underfunded staff across all of our district, underpaid, I mean, because we have just been paying people lower than neighboring districts for way too long. And so we need to address that. And we have 3,000 fewer students than we did 5 years ago. And that we also need to address. You can't have the same district that we had 5 years ago when we had, and it's not just Oakland Unified. Charter schools have lost about 2,000 students over the past 5 years, I believe, and neighboring districts are also declining in enrollment. And so we're competing at this point. We know we're putting those ads out there saying, grow with us. So, definitely shout out to our enrollment team for trying to promote the district, but we do see billboards from San Leandro. We see postcards from Emeryville getting sent to people in our district. And so we do have to recognize that students are getting poached from us by other systems. And we have to do everything we can to keep our schools strong, to show that we are investing in our schools. We are supporting our staff. And so that's why we do have to make some adjustments. And even though it's very painful and isn't always on the timeline that we want it to be on, we do have to recognize that there are legal timelines and legal deadlines that we as a board have to meet. And so I do encourage everyone to get the word out, because I don't think people are as fully informed as they ought to be about what's being decided tomorrow night. So I appreciate you all for learning tonight and for helping to spread. This was a kind of a train the trainer event. So your homework is go study those slides and get the word out to others and help to explain and answer these questions for other people who weren't here tonight. So with that, I will appreciate everyone. And I think I'll call it a night. And thank you all. And I will be posting the recording online on my social media for those who want to view it later or share it with others. So thank you, everybody. And thank you to Caitlin and Mahogany for opening us up.
Sam, post the Q&A and the link on your newsletter.
Sorry, say again, Andre?
Can you